Good evening. My name is Bernie Margolis. Thank you for being so quiet. This is a library. Tonight we're going to make noise. We have a wonderful panel discussion on shared legacies. Part of our hope is, of course, to share the mission of the Partnership of Historic Bostons, and that is a mission that includes the sharing of our shared legacies, our heritage, and certainly our mutual respect. The mission of the partnership is, I think, worthy of at least reading to you the first paragraph, so I can prove that as a librarian I do know how to read, first of all, but most importantly because I think the principle in this mission is one of critical importance to us. To enrich the lives of the people of Boston, Massachusetts, USA, founded in 1630, by creating and presenting educational and cultural programs and events to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of enduring legacies in the historic links between Boston, Massachusetts, and Boston, Lincolnshire, England, founded in 1086. We hope to do that tonight, and we hope that we're doing that as part of our birthday celebration here in Boston, Massachusetts, of our 375th anniversary. This is Charter Day week, and actually I think this is the day that we come to celebrate as Charter Day, representing indeed the voyage of people from across the pond. And we're very, very appreciative of having quite a few guests here from Lincolnshire. I do want to acknowledge the Honorable Judy Kamak, formerly mayor of Boston. Please, Judy, stand so we can acknowledge your presence. She was a great mayor of Boston and equally qualified at serving birthday cake, which we will be doing here on Saturday at 1 o'clock, and we invite you to join us for those festivities as well. Tonight we have a wonderful panel, and that panel will be led by an equally qualified and distinguished moderator, Miriam W. She's a founding member of the Partnership of Historic Bostons, though most of us know her for her over 40 years of service to the Museum of Fine Arts. She served there as a lecturer and was a regular participant and a regular leader on many of the museum's tours, and certainly we know that she brings great knowledge about both the city of Boston here in Massachusetts as well as Boston, Lincolnshire. She wanted me to say very little about her so that we had the maximum time for her to introduce the distinguished panel, so I will respect her wishes and invite to our stage Miriam W.
Thank you so much. I think we have some additional distinguished guests here, the Bakewells, and we will address them shortly. I'd like to ask Wilfred Houghton to stand up as president of the Partnership of the Historic Bostons. Of course, we're trying to make links with Lincolnshire and Boston, England, and the number of Puritan families that came from Lincolnshire, East Anglia, and the west of England. But my personal goal, which I hope you will accommodate by just getting yourself into your car or on foot and explore the collections of Boston relevant to the 17th century history, and to go to Ipswich and Salem and to see what the links are west of Boston. It's very important to do that. We are not just a library here, which was founded in the townhouse of Boston in 1657, where there was a library, and this crown jewel in which we're sitting here, the Boston Public Library and its resources, both places always open and free to all. I'd like to introduce to you tonight, and thanks to President Bernard Margolis for hosting us here, Eve LaPlante on my left. She is a writer and public speaker. She is the author of American Jezebel. Wonderful title. Think about it. The Uncommon Life of Anne Hutchinson, the woman who defied the Puritans. Imagine taking that on. Member of the Authors Guilds and the American Society of Journalists and Authors. Her forthcoming book is a biography of her sixth great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. I've tried this at home several times. Samuel Sewall. And from what I read in the Massachusetts Historical Society book, that he was both minister and magistrate. I hope that's correct. You can catch me on that. She is also, and perhaps fascinating because it personalizes the story about which we're going to hear, the story of Anne Hutchinson, the American Jezebel. So she will be our first speaker. The second is Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. I have a question for her. Is she related to Thomas Thatcher, who wrote the guidebook of smallpox? Not to worry. She is Phillips Professor, think about this, of Early American History at Harvard University. She is author of Good Wives, Image and Reality in the Lives of Women in Northern New England, 1650-1750, published in 1982, and articles and essays on early American history. She won the Pulitzer Prize, let's clap, for history in 1991, and for A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary. My first interest in diaries, journals, court records, letters came from my introduction to the letter of Thomas Dudley back to England to the wife of the Earl of Lincoln, the mother of the Earl of Lincoln. And it was an account in March 1631 of Thomas Dudley arriving in New England with the Winthrop fleet of 1630 and coming in at last to Cambridge and finding a home for himself. He said, "Here I sit, writing back to the Countess of Lincolnshire, and writing on my knee." This interested me the most. My children telling me what I can and cannot say because of the stress of the moment, just barely removed from a thatch-covered wigwam-type space to a more elegant home in Cambridge, England. The Reverend Professor Peter J. Gomes is the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister of Memorial Church, Harvard University. He is regarded, think of this, as one of America's most distinguished preachers. He has filled preaching engagements throughout America and the British Isles. This might be the link we're looking for. He is an honorary fellow of Emmanuel College, the University of Cambridge, England. He is the author of numerous best-selling books and sermons, and we'd love to hear your view from the pulpit later on. Please begin. So I'll ask Eve LaPlante to begin, if she's comfortable with that. She will talk from the descendant of Anne Hutchinson. Later, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, through scrupulous research in court records, account books, letters, and deeds, will speak about how women moved well beyond the confines of house to yard, as she says in one book, and were involved in every aspect of their family's world. I was caught up with Laurel's writing, and I thought of one researcher who said, maybe I borrowed this from a book on crossing over. by Everett Emerson, someone who went through 140 boxes of letters and family paraphernalia and found nothing. And here she has found so much. Peter Gomes will comment on what could be the most lasting legacy of all, the English language as used in all its nuances by our founding families. Now, time and distance, appointments and problems are something we all face. They may take a different venue. Do as you wish, and we look forward to your every comment.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you all for coming. I'm honored to be here. This story for me starts when I was a little girl growing up in Brookline, which used to be called Boston Common because the wealthy citizens of early Boston kept farms and grazed their cattle there. I had a great aunt who was deeply interested in family history. And for my 13th birthday, my Aunt Charlotte gave me a family tree she had painstakingly prepared that went back in some lines more than 20 generations, mostly to England. I can't say I appreciated its meaning, although I did try to fill in some of the blanks on my paternal French-Canadian side. But I carried it around for me for years. Its awkward size and shape made it hard to find a place for it on a bookshelf, and I never quite knew what to do with it. Every family has an Aunt Charlotte, I now believe, someone who's the repository of the family history, who researches the family's past to pass on to younger generations in written or oral form. My Aunt Charlotte lived at the tip of Cape Cod in a little red house across the street from Provincetown's Red Inn, which she ran. When I was a child, she would regale me with stories of our shared ancestors. They were colorful people, clearly, and some of her stories caught my attention. There was Anne Hutchinson, the heretic whom John Winthrop banished from Massachusetts as a woman not fit for our society. Especially memorable to a child was Hutchinson's death. In 1643, in what is now the North Bronx, Indians scalped Anne Hutchinson with all of her little children, my aunt told me, with what seemed a little bit too much glee. Instead of feeling proud of Anne Hutchinson or of what I knew of her, I cowered in shame. Why, I wondered, would anyone want to be descended from a heretic? Not that I knew what a heretic was, other than something bad. But Hutchinson had been kicked out of my own state by John Winthrop, who always seemed reasonable and able to compromise. What on earth had my 10th grade grandmother done to incur his wrath? What she had done, I learned in recent years while researching and writing a biography of her, was to violate the social order of the Bible Commonwealth by holding public power. Women didn't have public power in 17th century Boston. Their power was private. The Reverend Cotton Mather correctly called the women of New England the hidden ones. Women ran households, birthed and raised and taught children, tended crops, did brewing and dairying, analyzed scripture together, and traveled around the country on foot, on horseback, by ferry, and in canoes. Despite all this, as my colleague Professor Ulrich has so eloquently pointed out using a biblical metaphor, women performed their work under a bushel, whereas men's candles burned on the hill. Anne Hutchinson is an icon of our culture's suspicion of a woman wielding public power. She exemplifies why there are so few women even today in American politics, and no woman has attained the presidency. This colonial rebel, who was born in Elizabethan England in 1591, grew up in Shakespearean London, and died in that Indian raid in the North Bronx in 1643, was a Puritan preacher's daughter, midwife, and mother of 15 from Lincolnshire, who crossed the Atlantic in 1634. In an era when no woman could vote, hold public office, teach outside her home, or even talk in church, Hutchinson ran meetings at which she interpreted scripture and critiqued ministers' sermons before growing audiences of women and eventually men, including the colonial governor, Henry Vane, a statue of whom stands in the lobby of this library. When Henry Vane attended Anne Hutchinson's Bible study meetings at her Boston home, the young governor sat at her right hand. Women in Puritan England had held similar Bible study meetings, and while these meetings were not encouraged by church authorities, they were allowed. These meetings were hard to distinguish from the regular meetings Puritan families and communities held regularly to pray, repeat sermons, and sing psalms. Women were not directed to run these meetings, and they were officially banned from doing so, but the line between a mother and a preacher blurred in a culture that encouraged daily reading and discussion of Scripture. In this way, women in England assumed leading public roles at the local level, especially over female servants and children. Beyond that, of course, and officially at all levels, they were barred from public power in the church. In Boston, Anne first offered theological counseling and advice to other women in the privacy of their homes, and she avoided the regularly scheduled gossipings for which she felt no need on account of her own strong sense of communion with God, which arose from her father's teachings and from her own hours of Scripture study. Some of her magnetism and influence resulted from her high social status. Her husband, William, arrived here with 1,000 gold guineas, a vast sum that enabled him to purchase an acre in the best part of town just across the road from Governor Winthrop, and to build on it a handsome timber house with a stone foundation. William was admired by all, including Winthrop, and was soon elected a magistrate of the General Court, the highest authority in the colony. Anne's power also came from her role as a nurse and midwife. Many women died in childbirth, and nearly half of their children were dead before their 5th birthdays. So a trusted nurse midwife was held in high esteem by everyone. Anne's happy, fruitful marriage and her evident success as the mother of a large family also contributed to her standing. She began running these small religious meetings in 1635 as a natural outgrowth of the spiritual teachings she slipped into her visits to women's bedsides. Each week, more women came to hear her talk about Scripture and salvation, and some brought their husbands. By 1636, she was running 2 evening meetings a week in her house overlooking the sea. The footprint of that house, incidentally, is still in downtown Boston in the old corner bookstore, which was built in brick in 1718 in the orientation and on the footprint of the wood house that Will built in 1634. In her parlor, Anne sat behind a table that held her Bible open to the passage she was discussing and skipped from passage to passage, for she had memorized large sections of Scripture. She analyzed the mysteries of God's grace and salvation, the recent sermons of the ministers, including those she did not admire. Her audiences often numbered 80 men and women, nearly 1 in 5 of Boston's adults at the time. The Reverend Thomas Weld of Roxbury lamented that members of her audience, being tainted, conveyed the infection to others, including some magistrates, judges of the court, gentlemen, scholars, and men of learning, captains, soldiers, chief men in towns, and some eminent for religion, parts, and wit. Anne Hutchinson had stepped out of her place. In the phrase of the minister from Salem, Hugh Peter, she had rather been a husband than a wife, a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate than a subject. By 1637, her power rivaled that of John Winthrop, the founder of the colony. Winthrop derided her as a woman not fit for our society, an ally of Satan, and then referring to the ancient Israeli queen, who's widely recognized as the most evil woman in the Bible, Winthrop called her this American Jezebel. Unable to silence her, he brought her to trial before the court in November 1637. During the trial, he reminded her she was behaving in a manner not appropriate for her gender, according to the Bible. Hutchinson did not challenge the view that women's power is private, and even tried to use it in her defense. When Winthrop asked her where she found her authority to run meetings and teach crowds, she cited St. Paul's letter to Titus, which describes older women as teachers of honest things. She said, "I conceive there lies a rule in Titus that elder women should instruct younger, and then I must have a time wherein I must do it." Winthrop corrected her, noting that Titus says elder women must instruct the younger about their business to love their husbands and not to make them clash. And the passage indeed goes on to say that elder women should teach younger ones to be temperate, chaste, domestic, and subject to their husbands. Switching scriptures, Hutchinson cited the Acts of the Apostles 18, where a married couple instruct a man named Apollos, a man of good parts, but they, better instructed, teach him. A marginal note in the Geneva Bible, which Anne Hutchinson and most Puritans used, justified the revolutionary idea that a woman could teach religion even to a man. The note says, Apollos, a godly and learned man, did not refuse to profit in the school of a woman, and so became an excellent minister. Winthrop mocked her for this comparison. "See how your argument stands," he said. "Priscilla, with her husband, took Apollo home to instruct him privately. Therefore, Mistress Hutchinson, without her husband, may teach 60 or 80? I call them not," she replied, "but if they come to me, I may instruct them." "Yet you show us not a rule," he said. "I have given you 2 places of Scripture," she said. "But neither of them will suit your practice," he said. Her calm here dissolves into sarcasm when she says, "Must I show my name written therein," meaning in Scripture? Her retort seems especially ironic in light of how rarely women's names appear in the records of colonial America. But Winthrop could not appreciate her wit. Her speech and actions were out of place in a woman, which suggested to him the presence of the Antichrist. He suspected she used satanic powers to subjugate men in order to establish a community of women to foster their abominable wickedness. That's a quote. In his view, a world in which men and women are equal would be rife with adultery. There's a long history of associating female sexuality with evil, going back to the ancient Queen Jezebel, who's described in the Bible as applying color to her lips before engaging in battle over whether to worship Yahweh or Baal. Think of Mary Magdalene, who appears now to have been known in her own time as Jesus' best disciple. Or consider John Winthrop's response to the news of abnormal births to both Hutchinson and her friend and follower, Mary Dyer. Dyer had a stillborn anencephalic or severely brain-damaged daughter in 1637, and 6 months later, Anne Hutchinson had an abnormal pregnancy known as a hydatidiform mole, which she carried almost to term and nearly died from. A hydatidiform mole, a blighted ovum that's fertilized, grows like a cyst in the womb, and when removed, I don't need to describe it. Well, I guess I should. When removed, it looks like a bunch of small grapes. My husband's a pathologist. To Winthrop, these abnormal births were proof positive of the women's links to the devil. And this is a quote from his journal. "Mistress Hutchinson, being big with child and growing toward the time of her labor, brought forth not one, as Mistress Dyer did, but 30 monstrous births, or thereabouts, some bigger, some lesser, none of human shape. See how the wisdom of God fitted this judgment to her sin every way. For look, as she had vented misshapen opinions about theology, so she must bring forth deformed monsters." In court with her, he cited scripture passages in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy that admonish women to be silent and passive and not to teach. This general wish for women's invisibility extended, of course, into the courtroom. As he explained to Hutchinson, "We do not mean to discourse with those of your sex." He was arguing, of course, for nothing more than the role expected of any 17th century Englishwoman, who should be modest, virtuous, and obedient. Complex discourse, deep thought, and books would tax her weak mind and keep her from pleasing her husband, who was her superior intellectually. Winthrop confided that a woman who had a breakdown had a breakdown because she gave herself wholly to reading and writing. If she had attended her household affairs and such things as belonged to women, and not gone out of her way and calling to meddle in such things as are proper for men, whose minds are stronger, she might have kept her wits and used them honorably in the place God had set her. Winthrop was speaking for all men, and indeed most women of his time and place, according to Professor Ulrich. Most women of the 17th and 18th centuries viewed themselves as their husbands' possessions. Anne Hutchinson may not have felt this way, for her marriage appears to have been unusual. But still, during most of her time in Boston, she was present as an absence. And as soon as the men of power learned of her teaching and leadership, they brought her to court to remove her. The only reason we know any of her thoughts is that she so irked these men that they recorded her every word at her 2 trials, producing the thousands of words of court testimony that became the main written source material for my book, American Jezebel. Her power was, by definition, private. As a woman of public power, she could not exist and had to be cast out. Even with 20th century improvements, such as female suffrage and equal rights, the absence remains. None of our nation's recognized founders is a woman. Women serve as a small minority on the Supreme Court, in Congress, and on the President's cabinet, and no woman has attained the nation's highest office. Most noted females in American political life are first ladies, such as Abigail Adams and Eleanor Roosevelt. And booksellers have attributed the success of Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton's memoir to her, quote, status as a dual symbol of female victimhood and power, close quote. In the 4 centuries since Europeans colonized America, women have largely been excluded. Following Hutchinson's civil trial, which was held in Harvard Square, Winthrop and the court banished her as a heretic. A week later, as Reverend Gomes has pointed out in a story in Harvard Magazine, she became midwife to the nation's first college. The court voted then to build Harvard College to fortify Orthodox power and prevent a charismatic radical from ever again holding sway in Boston. In March of 1638, she was released from 5 months of imprisonment and tried by the First Church of Christ in Boston, which consigned her to Satan and cast her out. The next week, she walked in thigh-deep snow to Portsmouth, Rhode Island, with more than 50 followers, becoming the only woman ever to co-found an American colony. A few summers ago, while researching American Jezebel, I rented a beach house in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, a coastal town north of Newport. The public library there displays household objects, clay pipes from England, Delftware pottery, thimbles, a chamber pot, that she and her neighbors threw into a midden or garbage heap in the first half of the 17th century, providing a rare window into domestic life at the time. My landlord mentioned that the elderly man who discovered this archaeological site while walking his dog in the beach in the 1950s lived just up the block, and I ventured to talk to him, and he offered me a tour. We couldn't reach the site of the excavation on foot, but he drew me a map that enabled me to reach it in a kayak with my children the next day. Afterwards, I went to thank him for showing me the way to the isolated beach where my ancestor had lived. You know, he said, Anne Hutchinson had nothing to do with the founding of Rhode Island. I thought he was joshing me. Nothing to do with it, he said. What do you mean? I asked. Her name isn't on any of the documents. He said of the woman who refused to stay in her place. To prove his point, he listed the signers of the Portsmouth Compact, which in 1638 had transferred ownership of Rhode Island from Narragansett Indians to 19 English settlers. They were Anne's husband, several of her sons and sons-in-law, and her strongest male supporters in Boston, who accompanied her voluntarily. Well, of course her name isn't present. Women in early America couldn't sign land deeds or any legal documents. Female names appear in the paper record only at birth, marriage, and death for the most part. It's almost really as though women didn't exist then. The problem of Anne Hutchinson, the scholar Amy Schrager-Lang has written, is the problem of the public woman. Or, as John Winthrop said during her trial in 1637, public power is not tolerable or fitting for your sex. Learning about Anne Hutchinson's world has made me more of a feminist. Raised in the 60s as the single daughter of a single mother, I thought girls and women can do pretty much anything that girls and boys and men can do. Now I have doubts. Both Senator Clinton and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice are discussed as viable candidates for president in 2008. But my reading of colonial Boston history and its palpable effects on our political and social systems leads me to doubt if either woman has a chance simply because of gender.
Eve?
Yes?
I might interrupt you here, and through discussion later, we can further your narrative. I'd like to introduce Laurel Ulrich and proceed on behalf of the three panelists. It's particularly awkward, but I think we all have so much to say. I appreciate your narrative very much. Laurel?
Well, I was hoping, and maybe I'll offer a second of my time back to Eve to tell us about the events on Friday and on Sunday. Could you tell us about that? Because I think that's
Sure. In 1987, Governor Michael Dukakis revoked the banishment order against Anne Hutchinson 350 years after it was issued. And he and others will be speaking on Friday morning at the State House at the dedication of the Anne Hutchinson statue, which has been there since 1920 or 1921, but was apparently never dedicated.
and apparently controversial. Eve has a wonderful column on the editorial section of the Boston Globe today. If you haven't seen your paper, take a look. Well, after hearing about the infamous John Winthrop, the founder of Boston, I feel a little nervous telling you that I'm going to give you some vignettes from Winthrop's journal. A number of years ago, when the wonderful new edition of the Winthrop's Journal came out from the Massachusetts Historical Society, I decided to just sit down and read it straight through. And I certainly had read the sections dealing with Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer and various other things, but I hadn't sort of sat down and from beginning to end read this as a document. It's interesting because Winthrop refers to himself in the third person throughout, in a kind of modesty, the governor this, the governor that. And it is a story about public affairs, public events, about the founding of the colony from 1629, before they have left, until Winthrop's death. And what amazed me is how many women were in it. And they're in there in part because of Eve said they were so irksome. They were such a problem to Winthrop, who I think was a very, very conservative man in terms of gender. But what became clear to me as I read this journal is how feisty and interesting and sometimes troubled these early women were, and how much they were able to disrupt the community, which caused me to turn that theme around a bit and say, if they could be that irksome, they had some kind of power, and the power of private relationships and influence on others, charismatic power in the case of Anne Hutchinson, and certainly religious power and social power, which are not the same thing as political power and public power, but are not insignificant. And we need to remember that Massachusetts is not America writ large, even in the 17th century. My name, Thatcher, has led a lot of people to think that I might be descended from some early inhabitants of Massachusetts, particularly since I've written 3 books about New England. But I'm from the Rocky Mountain West. My Thatchers were from West Virginia. My other relatives were Mormon pioneers. My earliest relatives in America were, in fact, Quakers, a sect of people that many of Hutchinson's followers joined, and of course allowed women to preach and teach. So I'm kind of proud in some sense of not being from New England, but I've also loved being here, and I've been here since 1960 and feel this is my adopted home. And I do love Boston. I'm very thankful to be here this evening on this occasion. I want to tell you two stories. They're very, very simple stories. They come from Winthrop's journal. Each of them has a woman in it, an unnamed woman, interestingly enough. And each of them has to do with the material circumstances of people's lives. These stories seem suggestive to me because of what we as a nation have been going through in the past week with Hurricane Katrina. We have seen the devastation that happens when people are displaced from their homes, when they lose things that are near and dear to them. It's also dear to me because about a year ago, my son's house was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. And I realize how quickly any of us can lose everything. If we think about these folks who came in the 1630s to New England from Old England, some of them from Boston and from other places, we can imagine them feeling a severe sense of displacement, a lot of it having to do with physical things, having to write on your knee with the children around you, as Miriam said. Anne Bradstreet, the poet, said that when she saw this new place, her heart rose up. It did not rise up in joy. It rose up in, feeling like she was going to be sick. I mean, how was she going to endure the circumstances here? Well, there's a fascinating little story in Winthrop's journal, in the early 1630s. He writes, "A godly woman of the Church of Boston, dwelling sometimes in London, brought with her a parcel of very fine linen of great value, which she set her heart too much upon, and had been at charge to have it all newly washed and curiously folded and pressed, and so left it in press in her parlor overnight." Now, what he's describing there is a custom that we've lost and no longer follow. But if you have very fine linen and you're aspiring to gentility in this period, you do curiously press your tablecloths into checkerboards or diamonds and make the creases very firm. And that kind of pressing adds to the beauty and sheen of the linen. You can see this sometimes in old paintings. And so she had done that. She had brought this all the way from London. She'd laundered it, pressed it. She had it in the press and left it overnight. And then what happened? Winthrop tells us she had a Negro maid went into the room very late and let fall some snuff of the candle upon the linen. So as by the morning, all the linen was burned to tinder, and the boards underneath and some stools and a part of the wainscot burned, and never perceived by any in the house, though some lodged in the chamber overhead, and no ceiling between. But it pleased God, this is Winthrop writing, that the loss of this linen did her much good, both in taking off her heart from worldly comforts and in preparing her for a far greater affliction by the untimely death of her husband, who was slain not long after at the Isle of Providence. Well, this is Puritanism. Although I will tell you that when my son's house burned, his comment was, "It's only stuff." It was really hard. It's only stuff. So we have our own kind of lessons that we can draw from this story. Now, this woman who the editors of Winthrop's diary tell us was probably Bridget Pierce, whose wife was a sea captain and he was lost at Providence Isle, not Providence, Rhode Island, in the West Indies. I think it's interesting as we think about this. Mistress Pierce both needed and feared her linen. Her linen was a temptation to her, and yet it was a symbol of household order, of gentility, of civility. Very much probably like the starched ruff that we see on Winthrop in the portrait. the possession of fine textiles and material things helped to establish a social order. And yet those same things could be a temptation. This is in the famous poem of Anne Bradstreet, that tension between needing these things to feel secure and safe in one's house, and at the same time knowing that the real world house is in heaven. I won't read the entire poem, but just a few lines. She describes waking in the middle of the night and piteous shrieks of dreadful voice, that fearful sound of fire, and seeing the flame consume her house. And then later she walks by the ruins. When by the ruins oft I passed, my sorrowing eyes aside did cast, and here and there the places spy, where oft I sat, and long did lie. Here stood that trunk, and there that chest. There lay that store I counted best. My pleasant things in ashes lie. And we think of those folks going back to their homes now in Louisiana and Mississippi. And it's not just about stuff. It's about your life. It's about the experience associated with those things. And I think maybe Reverend Gomes could do a better job of this than me, but I think there are some religious metaphors in this poem of Hutchinson. She talks about no longer will guests sit at her table, no candle e'er shall shine in thee, nor bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. The symbol of the candle, and Jesus as the bridegroom in coming into this poem. And then she recognizes, I think, in that turning point in the poem of the metaphor, that it's really a heavenly home that she cares about. And so she ends the poem, farewell, my pelf, farewell, my store. The world no longer let me love. My hope and treasure lies above. Well, I think we feel the humanity and the human story in these early experiences of loss. But we also feel, I think, very early on, this emerging, what is going to be an emerging middle-class culture in America that's very tightly bound around households. Suppression of women, but also women as possessors and caretakers and creators of these little kingdoms that continues on even into our own time with our passion for home ownership. And so that takes me to, again, I guess we're telling sad stories here, but it takes me to the second story from Winthrop's journal that I want to share with you tonight. And this is a story about Winthrop getting lost when he goes out hunting one day. And he tells us that he couldn't find his way back. He got out into these woods up near Mystic, and night fell, and he was lost. His story is kind of fun because he was a good scout. He lets us know that he always kept a piece of match in his pocket and a compass, and in summertime, so that he was able to make a little fire. And he found his way to a home from Sagamore John, who was one of the Massachusetts leaders along the Mystic River. And no one was home at the time. And so Winthrop tells us that he made a good fire near the house and lay down upon some old mats which he found there, and so spent the night, sometimes walking by the fire, sometimes singing psalms, and sometimes getting wood, but could not sleep. It was through God's mercy a warm night, but a little before day it began to rain, and having no cloak, he, again writing about himself in third person, he made shift by a long pole to climb up into the house. So he broke in, which I think is interesting. In need, it was his to take, and he broke into the house and he got inside out of the rain. Now, what kind of a house was this? And maybe there's an archaeologist in the audience who can tell me. He had to climb up into it. I initially imagined him going up through the smoke hole in a wigwam, a mat-covered wigwam. And but then I began to wonder. I went back and looked at Thomas Dudley's letter that Miriam mentioned to us. And he says that Sagamore John affected English houses. And I wonder if it was some kind of combination house, because it seems to have had a very tight door. Winthrop couldn't get in. He went in up over the top. Now, this house would have been made by a woman. Algonquin women made their houses. They made them, some early writers said they made them like garden arbors, very clever in the bending and weaving of saplings to make the frame of the house. And then they are covered with two kinds of mats, cattails and bulrushes, which have different properties. The external mats are going to be waterproof, as Winthrop found when he got into that house. The internal mats, early settlers said, were just almost like tapestries, covered in woven designs in the twining that these textile artists did in the creation of their house. These weren't linen tablecloths, but they were fabulous homemade textiles that are admired by the English. And unfortunately, Winthrop didn't notice. It was probably too dark. But what he did notice, and here's the fascinating thing about the story, the next morning, somehow he's able to look out, and he hears a noise, and he sees a woman approaching. Now, I would assume this might have been the woman of the house. Coming back, the Massachusetts people went out to their fields. They had fields sometimes a distance. They would come and go. But anyway, woman comes to the house, and Winthrop panics. And so whatever he does, he bars the door and won't let her in. And she pokes around a bit and eventually leaves. He says, perceiving she stayed there a great while, essaying to get in. And at last she went away, and he, the governor, Winthrop, returned safe home, his servants having been much perplexed for him and having walked about and shot off pieces, that is, guns, and hallowed in the night, but he heard them not. They had been looking for him. Now, that's all he says. Now, you imagine this woman. What does she think? Someone's inside her house. She doesn't know what hit. Why did he do this? Why didn't he say, I was caught in the rain. I am so sorry. Thank you for your house. Where was, for your hospitality, I needed to borrow the house. And I don't know why Winthrop did what he did. He was comfortable with Indians at one point. Chickatawbut, another Massachusetts leader, dines with him, and Winthrop says because he had clothes on, he allowed him to sit at the table. He attends some meetings that John Eliot holds. He mixes with Indians. I think it was not just the Indianness. I think it's because she was a woman. And just a few weeks before, they had whipped a man accused of soliciting an Indian woman sexually. And if you read the journal, you'll see that Winthrop was just terrified of sexual disorder as well as religious disorder. And this early colony has good reason for it. There is a lot of it. But I think it was embarrassment, perhaps not being able to communicate, feeling he wouldn't be able to communicate, and perhaps, really being terrified of being caught in this woman's house and alone with the Indian woman. Who knows? We will never know because he doesn't tell us. The sad thing, of course, is that this wonderful material culture that the English discovered as they came to Massachusetts has not survived any more than Bridget Pierce's linen. It's not survived because the terrible smallpox epidemic that was a major disaster and took probably 90% of those early peoples and left the English feeling entitled to inhabit not Indian houses, but Indian lands where they now would build their own English-style houses and plant their own English-style corns. And I think there are some enduring themes, as Eve says here, themes of our need for and fascination for material things, for caring for things, investing in things, but also, sadly, our foundation of our wonderful city here was also a foundation of a city in which some people didn't survive and disappeared, and stories cannot now be recovered.
Laurel, I think we all appreciate the continuity of your comments, that you bring the stories that you have and insights that you have to tell us and make comparisons with what's going on today. It was excellent. I'd like to introduce the Reverend Professor Peter Gomes. I would like you to visualize him as an honorary fellow at Emmanuel College and delivering a stunning lecture, and as well as at Canterbury Cathedral. His gift and use of the English language is without parallel, and he will help us to personalize this story. I personally hope he will discuss in one sentence the gift, above all, of the use of the English language. So here we go.
This is a curious situation in which I find myself, for no one has ever mistaken me for a descendant of the Puritans. Eve LaPlante rejoices in being descended both from Anne Hutchinson and Samuel Sewell. He's rather greedy, my dear, to take these two very prominent 17th century characters and claim them as your own. But it liberates me, in some sense, from having any responsibility for any of these people. As a matter of fact, I have no responsibility for this occasion at all, because I come from the town of Plymouth, which, as you may know, is a little bit to the south and a decade older than this city. We take the Pilgrims very seriously, but we have tended, for very good reasons, as have been induced here, to ignore the Puritans. Some say that's a 19th century distinction, but it's a useful one, and I intend to make as much of it as I can. Even though the 17th century Puritans, whom we celebrate today, would not claim me, I have made no small measure of activity out of claiming them. The two pieces that I have done in the popular press in recent years concern both Anne Hutchinson and Governor Winthrop. So I have a debt to both of them in one form or another. And I'll acknowledge that debt in this way. I teach a course on the history of Harvard College, and I teach it with a great deal of emphasis on the sort of extra textual stuff in the 17th century having to do with its origins. We all know the stuff about the Great and General Court. We all know the stuff about John Harvard, half his money in all of his books. We know the various stories attached to the legal act of foundation. But one of the things that we really don't know, and Eve LaPlante has alluded to this, is the fact that if one wants to look for an operative cause in the foundation of Harvard College, in addition to providing jobs for the boys, it was also meant to provide a place for sound teaching. so that heretical and erroneous doctrines would not have the easy way they appeared to have had under the influence of Mrs. Hutchinson. And so one might claim her as the midwife of Harvard College. Now, she didn't give it birth, but she certainly assisted at its birth. And I am certain that the General Court had very much Mistress Hutchinson's teaching sections in mind when they talked about dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to our posterity when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. This was an injunction, an indictment, not simply on the quality of the contemporary ministry, though there was a certain indictment of those contemporary ministers, and one can read between the lines of the sort of supine John Cotton and the various other clergy who seemed either sympathetic to Mrs. Hutchinson or unable to control her. Either way, what was needed was a militia of Christ, as Cotton Mather would later call it, the militia Christi. These people who would establish a college wherever after sound and orthodox teaching would obtain. And at least two of us at this table partake of the bounty of that institution to this very day, at least through our shared pension program. So, I'm indebted to Anne Hutchinson. Eleanor Roosevelt described her as the first of our four mothers. And Eleanor Roosevelt was also another woman out of place and out of time, and whose power and influence was far more considerable than many thought it ought to be. And that she should pronounce this benediction on Mrs. Hutchinson seems to be most apt and appropriate. I will not venture any comments on the junior senator from New York or on the present Secretary of State. There's much yet to be heard. Now, as far as Governor Winthrop is concerned, I don't think I would have liked Governor Winthrop. I'm certain I wouldn't have liked Mrs. Hutchinson, but I don't think I would have liked him, and I can be absolutely certain that neither of them would have had much room for me. So there is a great delicious pleasure in having the last word, they both being safely dead and can do nothing about what I say or write about them. I took a perverse pleasure in my colleague's account of the burning of the linen. That crafty Negro servant, I suspect she knew what she was doing. Absolutely. Think of all those cooks in Alabama and Mississippi who used to spit in the soup before they served it. There's something really perversely satisfying in thinking about that. But I have to rise to a higher level, of course. As I am the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals, I shouldn't focus on this alone. And so I must say, when I was asked by the New York Times in the year 2000, among many others, to nominate what I thought was the greatest sermon preached in the last millennium. Now think about that. The greatest sermon ever preached in the last millennium. I had no problems. Apart from those of my own publication, I nominated, and my nomination was accepted, that famous sermon of John Winthrop aboard the Arbella. And I argued that that sermon was important for at least three reasons. The first of which was that it was given not by a clergyman, praise God, but by a layman. We must remember that John Winthrop was not a minister. He was a layperson, an educated, thoughtful, biblically literate layperson. So this was a lay sermon. Second, it was a sermon of enormous ambition. That does not mean enormous length, but it does mean it had great scope. And thirdly, it provided what I presume to call the enduring metaphor for America. So enduring is that metaphor that people think that it was Ronald Reagan who invented the phrase, "a city set on a hill." Now, I'm sure Ronald Reagan and Governor Winthrop discussed that concept frequently, but the fact of the matter is Winthrop took it from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as recorded in the 5th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And as we think about our present state of affairs, I mean immediately our present state of affairs, both at home and abroad, let me read you some of Winthrop's ambition as he preaches his sermon aboard the Arbella before they set foot on the wild New England shore. This is what he says. He says, if the society is to avoid the danger of shipwreck, which for him is a metaphor for cultural destruction, he says, we should follow the counsels of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities. For the supply of others' necessities, we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and our community in the work. It doesn't get any better than that. Now, Winthrop may well be the fallen, misogynistic man that we all know him to be, and which I suspect we all men are. That may be so. And he may not have treated Mrs. Hutchinson very well either. We know that that is the case. But that does not in any sense suggest that for one fleeting moment he did not catch sight of the great vision upon which, under idealistic circumstances, first our society and then our republic was formed. The only pity in these great and heroic words is that it didn't work in quite that same way. And even if the motivation is mixed, and I'll grant you it could well be mixed. We know that the Mayflower Compact, for example, in Plymouth, is not an instrument of social liberation. It was a way to control fractious and dangerously seditious people who, in the absence of a legal patent, would run amok with the real estate. We know that. This may well be a part of that, to control and to contain those elements whereby people would pursue only their own interest and would forsake the common good. That having been said, the ambition is glorious. The metaphor is enduring. And I know of no other founding instrument anywhere in the world that can exceed the new model of Christian charity as a basis for forming a just, a compassionate, a decent, and a caring society. And I would argue that those qualities are never more in need than they are today. And that those who would claim this legacy, be they liberals or conservatives, Republicans or Democrats, Northerners or Southerners, men or women, if they would claim that inheritance, to carry out this ambitious enterprise would be for the good of all. And my affection for Winthrop has to do with the fact that he started something greater than he knew, it was larger than he was, and it remains an unfinished ambition in which the rest of us can join. If that is the case, then 375 years of the city of Boston is just a very small drop in the bucket, just a little beginning of a long enterprise that yet remains to be carried out. And if we spend as much time looking ahead as we attempted to do looking backward, we in fact just might be able to do it. Now, this may not be quite what was expected from me as somebody billed to talk about 17th century rhetoric, but I would suspect that this is very much in the spirit of 17th century rhetoric. It cuts to the quick, and if it makes you nervous or annoys you or makes you anxious, we have done our job.
Was very inspirational, and I think when we leave this beautiful Renaissance palace, the Boston Public Library, free to everyone, that you can look forward to coming in and using the resources of the library and follow up in journals and letters this wonderful comment you have made. I wonder if Mr. Gomes, Professor Gomes, Reverend Professor Gomes, if you would like to address questions to your neighbors to the right, Laurel and to Eve LaPlante, or to welcome questions from the audience.
Well, I'll certainly welcome questions, but I'm fascinated with Eve LaPlante, whom I've just met tonight. I read an early copy, a version before it finally came into print of her biography of American Jezebel, and endorsed it with great delight and great pleasure. I can't wait to see what you're going to do with Samuel Sewall. Is your take on Samuel Sewall a wicked old bastard who finally saw the light, or what are you going to do with him?
I'm going to make links between Samuel Sewall and St. Ignatius of Loyola.
Wow.
Painful for us all.
I'd love to say something that might bring Hutchinson and Winthrop together a little bit by asking this of Eve and of Peter, and that is, it seems to me that Winthrop pursued Hutchinson precisely because he believed in the values in the sermon that he preached on the Arbella. That is, he saw Hutchinson as a divider, as a person who was splitting the community asunder in those meetings by criticizing the preaching of John Wilson. And what happened? So what about that? Do you think we look back and it just seems horrible to us? But do you think within the lens that Winthrop was looking through, his ideals actually helped to drive his lack of justice and ability to deal with Hutchinson? I'd love to hear what either of you has to say about that.
I think that's entirely true. And he was initially, when I started to write the book about Anne Hutchinson, I was very concerned because I felt that the story of Winthrop against Hutchinson was such a dull kind of, this black and white, good and bad, evil and virtue kind of story that went nowhere. It had no human life or flaw. And what I was delighted to find as I wrote and researched the story was that in many ways John Winthrop and Anne Hutchinson were very much alike. And I found them in many ways equally sympathetic. They were really both incredibly gifted people. Certainly Winthrop was a brilliant writer. It's very difficult to dislike strongly somebody who wrote such a remarkable journal. And yet he seemed to have some flaw in his ability to allow some level of disorder in the Commonwealth. He tried to allow disorder, and he tried to compromise with people like Thomas Dudley, but there was this way in which he had to shut off rebellious voices or secondary voices that perhaps doomed the Commonwealth. And then, similarly, Anne Hutchinson had these extraordinary gifts which were really totally inappropriate for her place and station, and she expressed them in these moments, but then sort of had this quality of pride or arrogance or inability herself to compromise that made it hard for her to work in this society she was. It's an interesting question, too, about what we know of Anne Hutchinson. Basically, we know the Anne Hutchinson that Winthrop himself wrote. And he was sending these public relations and marketing documents back to London. His short story written after she was banished was an effort to maintain the charter and the land and the power that he had acquired coming over. So, and then we have the court transcripts, which were written probably by Simon Bradstreet, an assistant of the court, and somebody else, and we have Winthrop's accounts. It's all sort of through the prism of John Winthrop and the court that we even know her. We don't have her journal, We don't have her letters. We don't even have her grocery list. So he has given us her, and some scholars have said that he's made her more than she was because she was an easy target to fight, and so he could take these heresies as he saw them, pin them to Anne Hutchinson, and perhaps exaggerate her importance. So she is in that sense sort of not even a human, entirely human figure, although one would try to make her human.
Well, I agree that what we have of Mrs. Hutchinson we have at the hands of Governor Winthrop, but given that, if I were Governor Winthrop, I don't think I would have had much choice. He's a dangerous soul. If you're trying to organize not a debating society and not a utopian community in the sense of 19th century tolerant utopias, but if you're trying to organize the city of God, essentially, which he is trying to do, the kind of articulate commentary that Mrs. Hutchinson represents is of clear and present danger. And it is reading back into the record to suggest that it was wrong for him not to behave as an enlightened Alan Alda figure in the 20th century would have behaved towards a strong-minded and articulate woman. I think the fact that she was a woman, that she was clearly articulate, that she had a forum, a natural forum, and that she was not at all unwilling to use it. I think those would be four very good reasons that if you wanted to maintain control, you had to deal with her in one way or another. So whether she is a caricature created somewhat in the image of Carrie Nation or some a wild female Ayatollah, or she is simply misunderstood. She was just simply saying her prayers and trying to help other women do so. The fact of the matter is, from the perspective of those who had the most to lose, she was a risk. And they dealt with her as they dealt with all their risks in 17th century New England. They sent them to Rhode Island. And she and Roger Williams, that's another story.
Laurel, do you have a comment? No, let's open it up. I see a hand back there.
About 5 or so minutes, and have a little wind-up conversation. If you have a question, please address it.
Besides Ms. Hutchinson and Mary Wyatt, who were the other descendants against Von Winthrop?
The dissenters against Winthrop? Well, there's Hutchinson's brother-in-law who helped to found New Hampshire, and they sent some to Rhode Island, some to New Hampshire, the two neighboring states. And Dudley himself, people didn't agree, is the point. There was a lot of dissension in this community. What I think is interesting is that some people were able to compromise and work it out. John Cotton, who was Anne Hutchinson's close ally initially and her pastor, got the message and came around and supported. The group of ministers coalesced, but some of them wouldn't, and they left. And that's the American story. You go someplace else.
How does Professor Gomes rate the address of John Winthrop on the Arabella with a number of the speeches made by Abraham Lincoln and the inaugural address of John F. Kennedy in 1960?
Thank you so much. I love softballs like that. I'll pay you afterwards. All three of those addresses have one thing in common, and that is they are brief, and they tend to focus on single syllables or two-syllable words at most. They do not bloviate, as people like to say these days. But I would have to give the palm to Winthrop because it's the first. It sets the tone. There is a kind of high bar that both rhetorically and substantially he raises. Now, Lincoln's second inaugural, I think, still stands, in my opinion, as the finest American utterance. I really don't regard Winthrop's as an American utterance. It's an Englishman who happens to be lost off the coast of New England, but he's not an American in any sense of the word. So I would regard Lincoln's second inaugural, both for its prose and its ideal, as the finest prose, public prose uttered. And I would rank Mr. Kennedy's inaugural address as a pretty close second. I would add to that canon the first inaugural of Franklin Roosevelt, and one might look at one or two of the sermons of Martin Luther King. But the three that you have uttered, I think, are the crown jewels, and I think actually they come in chronological order.
We have one or two other questions? Yes?
I've been in the reproductions of the colonial houses, and they all seem quite small. And the accounts of Hutchinson's congregation, if you will, many of them appear quite large. I'm just wondering how crowds were accommodated, and if there was any thought of the fear of the mob in that.
Well, if you've been to the old corner bookstore building, have you seen it?
Oh, yes.
It's a nice size colonial by modern standards. So you could imagine a family with 15 children, not all of whom were alive at this point, but most of whom were, could manage quite well. It was much more spacious than Plymouth Plantation. And it had a large parlor, and people would sit on the floor and on benches, and there would be one chair in each house, apparently. Is this what you believe as well?
Yeah.
And the house, the chair was reserved for the man's use, but Anne Hutchinson sat in the chair. And then Vane, if he was there, would sit at her side. I think that house would allow for it would be like a very large party at a colonial home in Newton. Maybe 80 people could fit. But the thing about the mob is that Winthrop was right across the road, right across what's now Washington Street, and he could watch all of this as the people went in and out. I don't imagine there were 80 regularly, but there were as many as 80.
But it's not a mob because there's not a class element. In fact, the class element maybe goes the other way. A lot of her followers were merchants, and then you have the one person of title, Sir Henry Vane, who is following her. And Boston sort of supported her. I mean, Winthrop had to go across the river to Cambridge, in a way, and bring in deputies from the other towns in order to solve this problem. Is that right? Yeah.
She enjoyed, I think it's fair to say, she enjoyed a celebrity status, not only because what she was doing was unusual, but she was the only one doing it. And apparently she was doing it very well, so word of mouth would spread, and people would say, and this is where the clergy rise up at this point to some degree. People would say, well, I didn't understand what he said, did you? No, I didn't understand what he said either, but there's this woman, and she began to interpret, then she began to improve. And that was when the stuff began to hit the road, because it was all right to sort of say, well, this is what the Reverend Mr. Cotton means, and this is what he said. But that's quite different from saying, he said this, but he should have said that, and I'm saying this. That's another story entirely. This is why I hate sermon talkbacks.
President Margolis, I wonder if you have some more comments.
I just have a question. Thinking of American religion today, this is to everyone. Do we treat our heretics any different today than we did in her time?
Am I supposed to take? Well, it's very hard to define a heretic these days because there seems to be no orthodoxy. But we do find suspicious people who are regarded as speaking out of place and out of turn, and we don't like it. And so we try to find ways to marginalize these people. Now, we've run out of space to send them. California is full, no places to send such people nowadays. But we counterattack. We try to suppress it. We will call them unpatriotic, un-American. We have our ways of suppressing people who cut across the conventional wisdom. The one reason that I think Anne Hutchinson stands head and shoulders above everybody else is that she was one of the first to do this. And in microcosm, we see what a bad consequence it was to treat her in that way, how paranoid the culture seems. This culture is equally paranoid, but it's so diverse, and we have so many different ways of dealing with the threats to our paranoia that we don't even notice that we're doing it. But I think we would do it again if we could.
Yes, but I think we need to think about religious pluralism as being the creation of this kind of dissent. And certainly Anne Hutchinson wasn't an advocate of religious freedom. I mean, she's sometimes attached to that, but she helped to create it through her behavior and through her earnestness, as did many others. Pluralism, even though there were state-sponsored churches until the Revolution, religious pluralism was a fact from the beginning, just because you had to attract colonists. And in order to do that, Massachusetts was really tried hard to be exclusive and not to allow dissenters. But even in Massachusetts, there were people who just wouldn't toe the mark.
I'd like to suggest that we conclude the evening. I have a couple of comments that if all of you are full of energy, we'd be very happy, the partnership of the Historic Bostons, to have you join Professor Wilfred Holton on his tour of 17th century landmarks in Boston, and you can talk with him at the end of the evening. But there are one or two other shared and enduring legacies that I'd like to share with you. Well, why don't you go down to the front of Faneuil Hall or the Custom House, where the waters lap the shore, and come up through the burying grounds by King's Chapel and the old Granary burying ground, and jog past Boston City Hall and walk along the paths of the the Common, which Boston in 1634 was willing to be taxed for, an open space that we should address and recognize as an enduring legacy. And then go to the public garden and walk through Commonwealth Avenue. And my husband and I did this, and we kept bumping into bridges and overpasses and automobiles. You can go as far as Franklin Park. My comments are that one of the enduring legacies of the 17th century is open space. And you can meditate as you go past all the corners along Commonwealth Avenue and think about the very rich church heritage that we have here in Boston. The African Meeting House, the churches from Arlington Street right towards Trinity Church, and recapture the impulse to good taste and moral basis to the city of Boston. I thank all of you panelists for being here and taking the time to put together your thoughts and personalizing the stories. So we hope you will join with us in other activities that we have coming up. Good night.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Well, it turned out we were all, we were complimenting each other.
Complimentary. What state is the book?
The Sewell book?
Yes.